In order for this system to maintain itself, it is a political necessity for black people to be out of their minds. And I follow, yes, and I follow this up with the refrain that I am not being rhetorical. I mean that literally. We have to be out of our minds. We cannot be within our basic natural personality. When you have a minority group of people that exploits a vast majority group of people the way our people are exploited along with other people, and those people are exploited without direct being directly put under the gun, or that being directly put into concentration camps, when those people are exploited by just going about what they see as their daily way of living, those people can only be exploited by being out of their minds, by being off-center, off-base. And I try to indicate then one of the fundamental things about a black psychology and African psychology in the context of today's world is that the African psychology must begin from the fundamental assertion that it is a political necessity for black people to be out of their mind. It is a political necessity for black people to be dumb. And that does not excuse even blacks with PhDs and well-educated. And I'll explain that in greater detail later on. You see, as we go along, how dumbness becomes endemic through all class levels of the black community, and how even education itself is an education into dumbness.
Hello, dear listeners. This is the State of White Supremacy, April 12, 2020. This post isn't going to be very long. I'm just going over a couple of books I've read over the past couple of weeks. I haven't watched any new films that have really gotten me to think about racism and that have given me any sort of that I feel that I have to talk about. But the two books that I've read, I feel I have to get this out of my head, otherwise it's just going to drive me crazy. The first book I want to speak about is Portraits of White Racism by David T. Wellman. I read this book because in one of Dr. Amos Wilson's lectures, he recommended the book. All the greats always recommend reading. Any great lecturer that you can speak of always gives you books, recommends books for you to read. Primarily, he recommended this book because it speaks about racism in practical terms. He doesn't speak about, white people love to slap us in the face with nonsense like prejudice and bias, but this book speaks of racism in respect that white people are racist because it benefits them in very practical ways. I have to say that the book that I read was a second edition, published 15 years after the first. The first book, I think, was written in the 70s, and the book that I read was published in the early 90s. So it's sort of it has some parts of the book that were not in the first edition that is addressing the racism at the time that the second edition came out. But the book, the whole main reason he recommended the book was that racism is practical. It is not an irrational, anger by whites. It is beneficial to white people to be racist. And their mindset is that there aren't enough resources in the world for everybody, so therefore they're going to get what they need to survive. They want more for them and less for everybody else. It's a matter of survival for them, And white people only support what's in their best interests. Our problem is that we see in their best interest, we see it in our best interest to protect their interests. That's our problem. We accept the idea of vicarious power. The more power they have, the more powerful we are. The slave mentality that has been consistent for as long as any of us can remember. I'll get back to that. This is why we don't pursue economic power and political power combined with military power. And regardless of how much we help them, they will never help us when things get bad. I'll get back to that as well. The book it centers around a series of interviews conducted with white people in the late 1960s. White people from different classes and different backgrounds being asked a series of questions about the period, and trying to in seeing all of this, despite their different backgrounds, different histories. the similarities in all of white people's responses to talking about, the news of the time, or the social inequality and what was to blame for it all, and talking about figures of the time and how they felt about it, and the common themes amongst all the white people were blaming black people for the condition. That was a consistent thing. White people or black people needing to change, whether it's black people need to get jobs or black people need to be educated. That's a consistent thread. They all consistently try to avoid incriminating themselves. That they never did anything wrong to a black person. They never practiced racism. Which is a consistent thread when white people are being questioned and racism is the topic. They're trying not to incriminate themselves, trying not to back themselves into a corner. The society is never to blame for the problems of black people. All these white people defend their social structure, the society. They adamantly defend that. At some point, a few of the interviewees at some point made themselves into victims of black people. Of some white woman talking about being shoved or by black people getting on a bus or something, and another white man talking about being in the military and getting punched in the face by another black trainee. Some white hippie girl talking about being black males, being threatening to her. All of these white people, they never did anything racism, but they all at some point they had to make themselves into victims, of black people. One of the white people claimed that black people need to stop seeing themselves as black, and that would solve the problem of racism. One claimed that educating black children in their African heritage would do them no good. In fact, it was bad for them. One white man claimed that he didn't like Kwame Ture, a.k.a. Stokely Carmichael, because he came across like he thought that he was better than white people. He wanted black people to think they were better than white people. And he claimed that he liked Martin Luther King because in his mind, Martin Luther King didn't appear to be doing much for black people. And then the white man said that he liked Martin Luther King because he didn't come across like he was doing much for black people. Which, of course, this white man claiming that he wanted to come across like he wanted equality. He didn't like that Stokely Carmichael was trying to empower black people into thinking in his mind that black people were better than white people. He tried to come across like he wanted equality, but at the same time, he claimed he wanted equality, but of course, liking someone who is not helping black people confirms that he didn't want equality. Because things aren't equal in this society. So being for somebody who's not helping black people is basically saying you want inequality. The white people don't want equality. This white man makes it very clear that he was made uncomfortable by anything that he saw as potentially affecting his status in the society. Made that very clear. And that's exactly what this book is about. It's about making it clear that white people are obsessed with protecting the structure of the society that puts them in the best possible position to succeed and makes things harder for people that are not white. It's like, the very notion of equality under white supremacy is a radical thing because everything under white supremacy is out of proportion. Everything is backwards. We might say I don't want black people to be equal to white people. I want black people to have power, and for black people to be able to oppose any group that threatens us. White people, Asians, Arabs, Latinos, anybody. I have no interest in being equal with any other race. But even being equal under white supremacy is a radical notion, even though people don't think of it that way, it is. And white people won't even do that. So white people don't want to be equal with anybody. We're the only people who frequently claim to want to be equal. Anything but actual power. We're the ones that want to be equal. And the latter part of the book is full of quotations from white students, because it's the second edition. The part that was, from the early 90s was full of quotations from white students when asked about affirmative action programs letting black students into their colleges. And the author made the connection between these older white people in the late 60s and what they were saying and these young white kids in the early 90s and what they were saying, and all of the same traits of the older white people were being said almost two decades later. These white students were saying the exact same things, all the same traits of blaming the victims or being against anything that would affect their status. Discrediting the notion that a black student deserves to be at their college, disregarding the success that the black students had at their college, trying not to incriminate themselves, trying not to come across racist overtly. It was the same, it doesn't matter if it's a white man, woman, child. It doesn't matter. The same traits. You're dealing with the same people. That's why I say that it doesn't matter what time the book is set that you read about racism. Is you're dealing with the same people. The author of the book, David T. Wellman, gives the interviewees the benefit of the doubt. But this is not a surprise because the author is white. So. He doesn't call them racist. He accepts the idea that they're ignorant, and all this sort of nonsense, and gives them a pass. There's a lot of cringe-inducing moments in the book because of that kind of writing, that kind of stuff. It made it kind of, some parts of the book were very hard to read because it was just irritating, a lot of eye rolling. Because the author just tries not to make, even though the book is called Portraits of White Racism, suggesting that the interviewees were racist, the author doesn't call them racist, and just gives them the benefit of the doubt, which I don't at all. Despite that, I do think that the book is a constructive read. To really stop using words prejudice and bias to describe white supremacy. It's about white people. Don't want to use the word privilege either. I hate the word privilege because white supremacy is terrorism. It involves death, destruction of people. So therefore, the term privilege always is inappropriate to me. I never use the term privilege in reference to white supremacy. It's like, in this society, like, it's easy, the way society is structured, it's easy for a black person and a white person to appear to be friends when there's no competition for status involved. But when white people's status is challenged, they reveal their true selves, and all that phony facade that comes across when black people and white people are being all chummy with each other just disappears. White people don't like competition. They definitely don't like black competition. They want everything to be as easy as possible for them. They don't want to have to compete with black people for anything. So I disregard all this fake, friendly nonsense that you see between people every day walking around. It's totally phony, I don't pay any attention to it, So, but white people, they seek to maintain, their social status by degrading and devaluing other people, So it's funny how the author of the book, at one point, he makes a reference to how white people define themselves not by who they are, but they define themselves by what they see themselves as not being. They create this other and then define themselves by the other, and that's what black people have always in this country have always represented, the other that white people use to define themselves, and they maintain their sense of identity by degrading us, They use us to define them. They see themselves as moral no matter what because they see us as the opposite of that. That's the main purpose we serve in this society, to be that other figure that they can use to make themselves feel moral. It's like I say that white supremacy is all about backwardsness. It's all about the reversal of logic. But this other syndrome is really white people regarding everything that they don't see as white, they see as other. This is why they destroy everything that they encounter. Every life form that they see that they don't see as a white person, they mistreat, because they're mutants. They're albino mutations. And they see all other life forms as other. They're disconnected from every other thing in the universe. And that's why they degrade and mistreat all other life forms that they encounter. It makes them feel normal. because being in the presence of a large number of another life form makes them feel abnormal. That's why they always have to be the majority wherever they are. It makes them really uncomfortable to not have dominant numbers where they are. They have to at least pretend that they're actually, a majority in numbers, even though they're the minority on the planet. And they maintain the society is maintained by that other complex. That's the same sort of mentality that people have that allows this society to lock up more people than any other country. Because we speak about people in prison like they're a different life form. That's how white people allow massacre. That's why a society will accept locking up so many people, is just seeing any people behind prison bars as just a completely different life form, separate from yourself. Therefore, it doesn't matter what the state does to them. They probably were, going to kill somebody anyway. That's the mentality that allows cops to kill us, and it's always justified. They were probably criminals and going to do something anyway. That's why racists can stalk and kill our children, and the society deems it just. The kid was probably going to kill somebody anyway. That other mentality that people just look the other way, don't even think about it. That other mentality. And how they define themselves. It reminds me of another book that I read just this week, Anatomy of Malice: The Enigma of the Nazi War Criminals. Because it's a book about basically the trials of a handful of key Nazis and interviews that were conducted with them during the Nuremberg trials, and it just goes from one guy to the next, and how his sort of behavior during the actual trial, and how some of them committed suicide, or just analyzing the psychology of what causes somebody to do what the Nazis did. And one of the interviewers wrote a book after the trials and everything, years later, about the interviews, and hypothesized that the Nazis were not psychopaths, and not much different than any people walking around in the society, and white people were furious. When he wrote the idea, white people in their minds, the Nazis, once white people found out what the Nazis had done, they had to isolate the Nazis and make them into this breed of white people, totally separate from them. They had the Nazis had to be something totally different, just like, communist, Russians. They had to be something totally different. Very few examples of white people finding a group of white people and trying to make it seem like they were something. They were the other, all of a sudden. And it just infuriated white people, the idea that that somebody would suggest that these Nazis were not psychopaths. The idea that they were just doing what any people would do if society told them that it was okay, if their leaders told them that it was acceptable, that they would do it. That it was so important for them to distance themselves, after the war from the Nazis, regarding all the trials and all the genocide talk, and try to speak about it as though it was totally different than what white white Americans did to Native Americans. Always try to make this what the Nazis did was totally different from anything that any white Americans did. That's why American war criminals are always given a pass. That's why after, like in Vietnam, like the My Lai massacre, nobody was really held accountable. The public didn't feel that the soldiers who participated in those massacres should be punished for what their leaders, a situation that their leaders put them into. That the soldiers, if they were being punished, were just being made scapegoats. But that's not how people talk about the Nazis. People don't say, if the Nazis committed an atrocity, the leader should be punished, but the soldiers, not like the soldiers should just be getting away with it too. Like, all of the soldiers were evil too. Nobody would say that, the Nazi leaders were evil, but the soldiers weren't. Like, any Nazi, they would say was evil. It's a totally different, speak of Nazis in totally different fashion. Just like, on Amazon.com, I was looking at books about certain figures, and it's amazing. I can find so many books demonizing figures like Muammar Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe, Fidel Castro, Idi Amin. You can't find any books demonizing, puppet leaders, non-white puppet leaders that give Europeans and Asians whatever they want. But they write so many books demonizing all of these other world leaders. One book called Idi Amin, the Hitler of Africa, as if we're all supposed to to not know about the long history of European mass murder all over the continent, the Nazis in South Africa, the Belgians, the Germans, the French, Italians, the British, every European group you can think of, and yet they make Idi Amin the Hitler of Africa, you know. It's like non-white leadership. This is conscious effort on the part of white people to make non-white leadership deliberately discredited. You know, to make sure that non-white people, especially black people, not see a black person in power as having any credibility whatsoever. That black people should want white people to be their leaders. You know, this whole other, you know, I mean, the last one that they praised was Nelson Mandela. You know, and everybody knows that was a crock. That he didn't do anything for black people in South Africa. Nothing changed for them. They exploited people's emotions about him being released from prison and pretended he actually helped those people. They repeated it with Obama, you know, exploiting people's emotions about him being elected and project this bourgeois notion that his presidency represented an advancement for the race, you know, total nonsense. But I mean, again, all exploiting our emotions, you know. You know, whites now trying to make Mao Zedong like the greatest monster in world history. You know, well, I mean, just like I said, just reading that book, that Surprise, Kill, Vanish, white people direct murder all over the world. They direct the starvation of African people. They spread diseases in non-white countries all over the world. You know, they create wars. They ravage the land of its resources. You know, and yet still call someone else more violent than them. Again, that's a white people defining themselves by how they project others. That's why any non-white leader in this world that doesn't let white people walk all over them is going to be presented as spoken of as the most evil person you could possibly imagine, despite the fact that whites, Europeans, direct murder all over the world. They want to control the world, and yet they would talk about somebody else as being more violent than them. It says a lot. But again, that's the white psyche. It's about, you know, it's always, they define themselves. Anytime they devote a lot of time and energy to trashing another world leader, it's all about a reflection of, you know, trying to get the focus off of them. That's how they define themselves, you know. And now I want to read more books about Idi Amin and Muammar Gaddafi and Robert Mugabe. I've started reading some about Fidel Castro, but I'm gonna start reading more, you know. Because these people said that the leaders that gave white people the biggest headaches knew that they were at war. You know, it's like if you read Castro knew he was at war. It's like, you know, it's like Che Guevara, he knew he was at war. I read his book on guerrilla warfare. He knew he was at war. You know, all these guys knew they were at war with Europeans. You know. And, you know, Che Guevara, he knew the kind of war he could fight. He knew the landscape and his enemy's capabilities. We can't fight war the way Che Guevara did, but not all wars are fought the same way. You know, like the Asian world knows they're at war with the West. They have always been. And they behave like people at war. And that's why they have power. The Europeans are at war with everybody in the world that isn't European. Everybody. Our problem is that we only fight for people that fight us. We only fight for the people who conquer us. You know, we can actually fight a war by simply not wanting to assimilate into another culture. No speeches, no marches, no boycotts, no riots. Stop wanting to live near white people. Stop wanting to marry white people. Stop wanting to work for white people. Stop sending our children to be educated by white people. Stop seeing our destiny as a race tied to the destiny of white people, and that will be fighting war. To give up all of those things, to abandon all of those things, would be fighting war, because it would give white people, it would just drive them nuts for us to not want to be with them. We don't need any militaristic rhetoric or anything, just gradual distancing from them. People want to talk about social distancing. We should have been we should need to be segregated. We should want, in our own mind, want to not be near them. That's a healthier mindset. I don't mind us being separated from white people, but it should be our choice. We need to make the choice to not want to be around them. That would be healthy. to not want to be around them. That we shouldn't even need laws. You know, we never needed any anti-miscegenation law. We shouldn't want to be with them anyway. We don't need to talk about. We don't need to even talk about it. It should be a common sense thing in our culture to not want to be around those people because they will cause us nothing but harm. You know. I know it might seem I've veered off a little bit from Portraits of White Racism, but you know, I'm talking about war, and racism is war. I do recommend the book Portraits of White Racism.
Is that in a racist society, or in a society where people are held in oppression, every institution in that society is essentially going to have the same goal in mind, that is to maintain the status quo. Mm-hmm. No institution escapes from that. And this is the thing that we have to keep in mind. Religion is an institution of this system. Education is an institution. The family structure is an institution. The justice system is an institution. The economic system is an institution. And each one of those institutions are not there to work against the interests of the people who are in control of them. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that religion will serve the intentions of the people who are in control of it and in control of its interpretation. We should not expect religion to be an exception to the rule. And I often tell, our people, and I try to get across the idea, you see, we have to recognize very clearly that it is through the institutions constructed by a society that society actually creates the personalities and the people and structures the society so that it may maintain its existence. And it is not going to permit an institution to exist that works against its existence. For religion ultimately to exist in many states, it has to become an arm of the state. It cannot, when it is seen as being against state interests, you will see the religious persons being persecuted and destroyed. The Romans stopped persecuting the Christians to a good extent because it ultimately makes Christianity a part of the Roman state, and it functions to serve the state. This is why we have to recognize when we look at institutions of any kind, that includes the family institution as well, the institution upon which families are based, which we'll talk about in some following program about love. That's supposedly the basis for marriage. We will see when you look at those institutions in relationship to oppressed people, they will always work in opposition to their names, to their titles, okay? Such that we're going to talk about the reversal, how black people must be made backwards. We have to be backwards, and our personalities have to be reversed to maintain the system. And it is the institutions that reverse the personality.
What do you mean by the institutions in this case?
Blacks have to be made dumb by education. Okay? They have to go to school to learn to be dumb. All right? We have to learn the economic system in order to be what? Poor. All right? We have to go to the justice system in order to be criminalized. And so you will see we are hooked into the European marriage system to have what? Broken families. And you study each one of them, and you look at the religious system to fall under the control of these other people, be victimized. I often say the churches will take us to hell, because often the ministers and other people who are in them, because of the way they're structured and because of their own miseducation, in guiding the people, misguide the people. They have love for them. They have great intentions for them. But with wrong knowledge, if they're struggling with their own self-hatred, you're not going to be filled with self-hatred and have a distorted mind and guide people properly, no matter how much you love them and how great your intentions are. And therefore, when you build churches based on it, he mentioned the conferences, the Nicene conference, where we know that the Bible was sort of put together, and when you look at schools of theology that interpret the Bible within the context of the European policy a structure. And you have ministers then who move forward under that theology. Despite their love, and despite their intention to get the people into heaven, they will often misguide them into hell. They would have to, given this system, because you see, religion in its true sense is an extremely rebellious situation. Because first of all, the truly religious person is not a person who falls under the authority of other individuals. One loves God above all else, so that all else has no power. You see? But when you love men, when you love the acceptance of men, the approval of men, status and position, and you need men to love you and all of this kind of stuff, these people are your gods. And you worship them before anything, and therefore you fall under their power. You see, and therefore the truly religious person who loves God better than life cannot be coerced in any kind of behavior, even at the threat of his death. And therefore you have very few really religious people in the world today, you know.
The other main book I read just this week was The Golden Age of Black Nationalism, 1850 to 1925 by Wilson Jeremiah Moses. The book was published in 1978. The author gives an in-depth sort of critique of the history of black nationalist thought. The author doesn't really give a definition of what black nationalism is, but he appears to attribute black nationalism to the ideology of all black people of the period in one way or the other. He sort of attributes nationalism sort of thought, any sort of pro-black or any sort of people who want to uplift the race, he sort of attributed black nationalism to them, even though at the time they weren't really called black nationalists. So this book is designed to, the author claimed that he wanted to, create controversy with the way the book is written, in terms of to really make people think about the concept of nationalism and not use it in a sort of throwaway fashion that people do and associate it with things that it's not really about. This is the most sophisticated examination of black nationalism that I've read. And the benefit of studying history is you see how most things you hear today or even in past decades are not new. And this book is full of a lot of things that people say now or have said in recent years that people were saying, 150, 200 years ago. The author doesn't take sides. The author doesn't appear to prefer any leader to another. All of them are spoken of in an objective way. You see how they're similar and how they differentiate. He talks about people like Alexander Crummell and Martin Delany and Henry McNeil Turner and Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey and many, 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 many others. More than I can even count. And talks about novels that some wrote and poetry and literature that some wrote that expressed black nationalist thought. And the author, makes it clear to show that black nationalists are not necessarily separatists, because most of the people he speaks of in this movie were not separatists. In fact, most of them were assimilationists. Most of them wanted black people to assimilate into white society. The book acknowledges that black people have been arguing about what we should be called before even the Civil War. That in the past 30, 40 years, the term African American had taken over in this culture, a term I never use, by the way. I've always despised that term. Just like at the turn of the 20th century, Afro-American became the term. But, even before the Civil War, terms like Anglo-African and Euro-African and Euro-Saxon and Negro-Saxon, that these were actual terms that people used throughout the 19th century, that some cases black people came up with to try to, show how much they wanted to actually be, a part of white society, these compound terms that really are designed to make us crazy. Because white people are one thing, and we're expected to, like Du Bois talked about double consciousness, we're expected to hold on to two different minds and be normal. and two minds that contradict each other, European and African. We're expected to be both of those things and be normal, and that's just a recipe to be crazy, you know. Asking someone to be both these things is begging for a mental, disorder. Kobe Kambon brought up this approach as this as an approach of trying to normalize insanity in black people. Now, not the black people at the time who came up with these terms weren't trying to. They didn't know how deranged this thought this is, the idea that black person expecting our minds to be able to balance these two things. You can be these two things at the same time. They weren't aware of it, but in subsequent years, other black people since have been far more aware of how damaging this is to the mind of a black person to try to be, if you want to make somebody crazy, throw contradictions at them. And asking somebody to be a European and African at the same time is a massive contradiction. And as Dr. Amos Wilson, his definitive statement, in order for this system to be maintained, we have to be crazy. And terms like, Euro-African, Negro-Saxon, that is the recipe to be crazy. And I have to say, this book is full of a lot of disturbing passages. Not things being said by white people primarily. Most of it is said by the leaders themselves, and it's full of a lot of very disturbing, self-loathing sort of things being said. But the author doesn't mean it. He doesn't mean it as to disparage these people. But the way I interpret it, it really just gets at the depths of the damage that Europeans have done to our minds. Even our most brilliant minds demonstrate so much self-hatred. If I hated someone for one offensive statement they said, then I would hate everybody pretty much. So I don't have anything. I have great sympathy for the people spoken of in this book, for the difficulty, what they had to put up with, because of the things that they had to see, the threat that was hanging over their heads so overtly, and that's why I say it's best to take what you hear them say that you feel is correct and disregard what you feel is not correct and use it to create a more refined black ideology. I can't think of one black person who I've heard speak about racism that I've agreed with everything that they've said. Some are just closer to the truth than others. The most common threads in this book, the damage European Christianity has done to the black mind. I'm so eternally thankful that my mind was never polluted with Christianity as a child, that my mother didn't take me to the church or anything, didn't pollute my mind with that garbage. I'm so thankful, because this book is so full of that. That's probably the most common thread that runs through all the book that makes all of these people different from the Nation of Islam that came later. Was they were all Christians. Some were actually, reverends and all that, but even like Marcus Garvey was a Christian, even though he wasn't he didn't call himself a reverend or a pastor or anything, but he was a Christian, and how some, going back as far as Alexander Crummell, wanted to migrate to Africa to Christianize Africans and to colonize them, really to the benefit of white people. It wasn't they weren't talking about going to Africa to build a black empire. They wanted to expand, to be the face of European imperialism and to colonize, as black people, colonize other black people to the benefit of white people and expand the white empire. That's the main difference. Like, Garvey was a Christian, but he never actually made it to Africa. But he surely would have attempted to Christianize Africans had he gone, but it wouldn't have been to the benefit of Europeans had he gone. It would have been to the benefit of black people. But again, this book frequently makes reference to how all of these people, in one way or another, could not abandon European thought, concepts, and values. And that's the main sort of thread that runs through the whole book, is about how all these people who claim to be for their race and against racism and all that could not abandon European concepts and values, regardless of how much research they did, or how much they claimed to be for African people, or books that they've written, or African history they might espouse. Very few did espouse, researched African history, but they could not abandon European concepts, and about how nationalism, that's, one aspect of nationalism. The love of European culture is an extremely disturbing, aspect of this book, is the amount of love and respect and admiration these leaders showed for European culture, and about how so many of them embraced all of Europeans' racist stereotypes of Africans, that they seem to see Africans on the continent as something, a totally different life form from themselves. They so absorbed the European identity and so identified with Europeans that they saw Africans as like something totally different, and talking about Africans needing to be civilized and black people in America needing to be made more moral. It's amazing to think that in the 19th century, that shortly after the Civil War, black people saw themselves as being less moral than white people. It's amazing that they saw that these black leaders were always telling black people, the population, that they needed to be made more moral. I mean, after centuries of formal enslavement and torture and rape and murder, and yet they still saw themselves as being less moral than white people. The problem was always black people. The problem was never white people. It reminds me of portraits of white racism, of that self-blame. That the problem is always black people. It's not the society. It's not the structure or anything, or the society or anything. It's always black people. So, the suggestion was always that if we cleaned up our act, white people wouldn't be as malevolent as they are if we cleaned up our act. I'm sure a lot of these black leaders simply feared the outburst of savage violence from whites, so they pandered to whites by saying the things that white people wanted said. A lot of black people did that. A lot of, even Garvey did that. Garvey, just like Henry McNeil Turner, he spoke to white audiences and black audiences and often said what racists wanted to hear, But, the effect I'm sure that had on the black population, constantly being told that they're the problem, is not a good thing at all, And there's a big difference between, and that's sort of a trademark of nationalism, is chastising the people who've been victimized. But the big difference with the Nation of Islam that came later was that they actually chastised white people quite a bit. Said a lot of nasty things about white people in a way that none of these people said. I can understand why the Nation of Islam was so shocking to people in the 50s and the 60s, because they hadn't heard black people publicly talking, like this. The only in the people spoken of in this book, the only time that they really ever made any attacks on whites was really in novels or in poetry in a very sort of sly way. But speaking out loud, they didn't. Wouldn't say anything to antagonize whites. Whites were antagonized even if they didn't say anything. And the end game for most of these people was almost always merging with white people was the end game. The goal was never for black people to have a powerful nation of our own until Marcus Garvey. I mean, W.B. Du Bois was like one of the first to write and speak about Africa in a positive way. That he actually did research on African history and ancient Egypt, and thought black people should model themselves on that history. He acknowledged that life began in Africa and not in Europe, unlike most of the leaders who came before him. He's often written off as simply bourgeois, black person, nothing else. Mostly people who've never read anything that he's written. The book has quite a bit of poetry that he wrote, and articles that he wrote, like a lot of people of the period, most of the leadership of the black leadership of the period was bourgeois. The author acknowledges that he labels most of them as most of the leadership spoke down to the masses of black people and told them they should improve themselves to get up to their level. The word bourgeois is used a lot in the book to define almost all the black nationalist leadership of the period. Even organizations formed by black females to combat lynchings had a bourgeois sensibility about them. Had a sort of Victorian era bourgeois sense of morality. It's a part of their love of European culture. Like Booker T. Washington's wife wanted to be able to ride and train cars separate from the lower class black people. They all had that sort of sensibility. They all accepted the dominance of white people as the norm. American exceptionalism was their dominant sort of ideology of so many of them. Like Alexander Crummell spoke of, he was probably spoken of probably the most of anybody in the book, but because the author, I think, wrote another book about him. So he's sort of spoken of by more. He was one of the people who wanted to migrate to Africa to Christianize Africans. Unlike like most of the leaders prior to Frederick Douglass, Alexander Crummell was never a slave. Prior to Frederick, most people who spoke like Martin Delany, a lot of leaders prior to Frederick Douglass were not slaves. Frederick Douglass was one of the leaders who actually was a slave. So he had more credibility in a lot of people's minds when he spoke about the evils of slavery and all that. But it's amazing that even though he wasn't a slave, during a speech he gave, I think in the 1890s, he told black people that they should stop thinking about slavery. So when you hear people today talk about it, just think about well over 130 years ago, maybe longer, only a couple of decades after the Civil War ended, you had black people telling the population they should stop thinking about slavery. So when you hear it today, it's not new, And if you think it sounds absurd today, imagine how absurd it sounded back then. For people to be told to stop thinking about something that lasted for centuries, that they were just a couple of decades out of the formal enslavement, and being told that they should stop thinking about it. That it's just a tactic that's been used and continues to be used to this day. He also said that the ability of black people to imitate white people was proof of our intelligence as a race. And it reminded me of Mein Kampf, actually, when Hitler said that black people just imitated human behavior. That's all we do. A black person could be a doctor, a black person could be a lawyer, but he's just imitating, what Europeans have done for that job. That's just all a black person can do is imitate. And I said, I'm not saying that Alexander Crummell, had an ideology like Adolf Hitler, but again, the misguided, the level of confusion of even the most brilliant minds back then, the level of self-hatred was it was incredible. And and it's like, Frederick Douglass, he was, at the time, he was a great sort of, took pride as an agitator to white supremacists. There's a story that's sort of relayed in the book about him walking down the street with a couple of white women on his arms to piss off people. Now, the book does, obviously Frederick Douglass was against, racism. He was against slavery, and he wanted black people to be freed. And after it was over, he wanted black people to be lifted up, and he wanted black people to, gain equality with white people. But he was adamantly against the notion of race pride, and was adamantly for race mixing as an answer to racism. The kind of stuff that people don't want to acknowledge. Like he thought that was a solution of racism. He was against the idea of black people he wanted black businesses to exist, but more as proof to white people that black people could be equals to them. He didn't want black businesses to be maintained consistently. He wanted to prove something to white people. That's the mentality behind wanting to put black children in school with white kids during the civil rights movement. It's about, we got to prove to white kids that we can be, white people, that we can be humans like them, and you can be with them. Because it came to mind watching a documentary I saw the other day, that Uppity, the Willie T. Ribbs story about a black race car driver that had to put up with racism in the 70s up to the early 90s, with white people sabotaging his cars and him having to go from one white racing team to another, with all these stints of being out of the job because he kept being forced out of the industry again and again, with being fired or having, all the racism he had to put up with. And, like a lot of those documentaries about that, the sports documentaries about that kind of stuff, and people calling, all of the cliches of people calling him the Jackie Robinson of racing, and the overall sentiment of the documentary is like that of almost all documentaries about past racism. He proves to whites that he can drive with them. Like we have to prove something to white people. I'm tired of seeing the headline, the first black this, the first black person to do this, the first black person to do that. It's 2020. What do you think that does to a black child's mind to be seeing, the first black person to do this? It gives the impression of us being some handicapped race. Because white people lock us out of stuff and being told, this is the first black person, as if we couldn't have done it before. The only reason that we hadn't was because white people they have a monopoly on everything and want to lock black people out of so much of the world. And we don't want to build it ourselves. Gaining the respectability of whites should never be our goal. They will never respect us. That will never happen, ever. Would you respect people who allow themselves to be enslaved? Would you respect people who love those who mistreat them if they're white? Would you respect people who care more about their enemies' children than their own? Because our inability to actually build stuff is proof that we don't really care about our children very much. If we cared about our children, we would build stuff to protect them. But instead, we just throw our kids to public school here and let white people destroy their minds. It's proof we don't care about our children. Would you respect people who fight white people's wars but never fight for each other? Would you respect that? Would you respect people who don't want to exist, therefore reproduce with albinos in an effort to bleach the Africanness out of their genes? Would you respect people like that? They will never respect us, but we can regain self-respect. We can regain our self-respect, but they will never respect us, and that should never be on the table. That should never, ever, ever be a goal for us, because we will never receive that. We'd be waiting forever if your goal is to gain their respect. But Booker T. Washington, those figures spoken of in the book, the book acknowledges that Washington in his life appeared as a accommodationist to white supremacy. That's kind of the label that he got. Of course, Marcus Garvey admired Booker T. Washington because he was about economic development. He was about building things, which is what Marcus Garvey was about, building industry, production, not just rights and laws and all that nonsense, but actually black people building stuff. Because power, you have to build things to have power. You can't just, laws aren't going to protect you alone. He was about economic development, and that impressed Garvey. And eventually, it took some years later, but Du Bois eventually came around to that in his book Dusk of Dawn, and he wrote it in like the early 1940s. After he left the NAACP, he came around to knowing the importance of economic development. Washington admired the Jews of Europe and said that black people should model themselves on the Jews. Of course, that's a routine, thing that people are always telling us, that we should model ourselves on this group, on that group, on the Asians, and all that kind of stuff. He said that money would provide protection and power to black people. Frederick Douglass concurred with this sort of thought that the black people just need to have money, and and that'll protect us and all that. And the author notes that Booker T. Washington said this only like a few years before Adolf Hitler was born, and about how the Jews in Nazi Germany, they had money, and money didn't protect them. Money alone isn't going to protect you, and of course Booker T. Washington, his ignorance about on this subject, is acceptable because this is years before. But the later assimilationists that came about in the civil rights movement, they looked dumb by comparison, because they came about in the aftermath of all that horror, and yet didn't see what the end point of assimilation was, but of not having military power to protect you. That money alone isn't going to protect you, because when people have military might, that overrides laws and money or anything. It doesn't matter. We learned that in Reconstruction. Black people had political office, and white people had the military might to just throw them out, physically throw them out. And that's why white people don't respect laws. Doesn't matter to them. That's why they spend so many centuries making sure they have a monopoly on everything in this society, so they can disregard laws. You can make a law, and then they can just ignore it, not enforce it. They don't have to do whatever they want to, and there's nobody to force them to do anything. We don't have any ability to force white people in this society to do anything. that money alone isn't going to protect you. You got to have money, political power, and military might to force people to do anything, and to protect yourself. And I said, like the Jewish Holocaust, that's the greatest example of the death philosophy of assimilationism. How come nobody ever asked black people to emulate Jews gaining their own nation? How come that? Nobody ever talks about that. Like nobody ever asks, how come we never pursued our own nation? We're supposed to, again, because the way this system is structured under white supremacy, we're supposed to be completely helpless. We're always discouraged. We're the only people in the world discouraged from being independent. Every other group can be independent, but black people in America, black people anywhere, people that's not supposed to have any independence whatsoever. To be in debt, even if you're on the African continent, to be in debt and oppressed. That's supposed to be we're supposed to see that as our normal, natural state of being. And like Booker T. Washington was for economic development, but he was not for economic chauvinism. Because that term is used a lot in the book too, chauvinism. And, in reference to, I guess that's a sort of I guess that's a means for people locking out other races, sort of chauvinism. The idea of black people only buying from each other and selling to each other, that came, much later. That wasn't what Booker T. Washington was an assimilationist. He wanted black people to prove to white people that he could do something, and then ultimately, of course he died before he met Marcus Garvey. Who knows, his ideology might have evolved to being something more than that. But, as it stood, up to the point that he died, his ideology was that of an assimilationist. He was not a separatist. Maybe Garvey could have convinced him to be, a separatist. Who knows? In previous post, I made reference to Ben Tillman saying that slavery civilized black people, and he referenced Booker T. Washington's book Up From Slavery. And in the book, they actually make a quotation from Booker T. Washington, which he basically said the same thing that Ben Tillman said. That he actually said that black people had no language before slavery, and it gave us this English language, and we had no culture before slavery, and it gave us this culture, about how we had nothing before slavery. So basically, Booker T. Washington said the same thing that Ben Tillman had. And this isn't to attack Booker T. Washington, but just so we can stop mindlessly putting people on pedestals and actually get speak honestly about the depths of the psychological damage that white people have done to us. Now, I said that most of these nationalists didn't speak of Africa in a positive way, and didn't speak at all about African history, about us having a history at all, and just sort of accepted the notion that we just was swinging in trees in the jungle and white people came and civilized us. That was the mindset of most of them. And I like how the author shows how similar figures were, how the figures are similar in some ways and how they're different in some ways, and how some people that everyone speaks of as being so completely different and maybe were even at odds with each other. And yet the author makes reference to how similar they actually were. People like Du Bois and Garvey might have riffed, but they were actually more similar than people let on. They definitely weren't complete opposites. They were just different generations. Garvey was the face of the new Negro movement that came about in the aftermath of the First World War. Garvey's militaristic talk about a powerful black nation made him quite different from the people that came before him in the way he spoke. Although he's a lot of what Garvey said came from Alexander Crummell and some of those other people were saying years before. But Garvey didn't speak about expanding European empire. He spoke about black people having our own empire, and none of those people before spoke like that. Like Garvey had a sort of survival of the fittest mentality. He talked about figures like Napoleon and felt those who conquered others were doing the will of God. So our goal should be to be a powerful people, and if we conquer other people, that's just the will of God too. Let the chips fall where they may. you know. And like again, Garvey, even though Garvey was so pro-black, he still sort of modeled, was a Christian, and modeled his sort of philosophy, his sort of approach to sort of European sort of authoritarianism. Was sort of his mentality was a bit, it was, you know, of being this ruler, this leader, this head of this organization, in a way that, you know, where the author always makes reference to how nationalists all model themselves on Europeans in one way or another, and how nationalism just, you know, that always seems to be the case. You know, that the movement, that the Garvey's movement chastised, you know, the bourgeois sensibility of the previous generation. He didn't chastise Booker T. Washington, but Booker T. Washington represented he had as much a bourgeois sensibility as Du Bois did, but Garvey didn't attack him for that. Like black people were thought of around that early 20th century as being naturally conservative and assimilationist, you know, and forgiving of whites for everything they've done and accommodating. And the author suggested that the rift between Du Bois and Garvey was actually good because it demonstrated that black people didn't all think the same, you know, and that black people were not all one ideology, you know, that's a good thing. You know, the last chapter of the book centers around the First World War and the impact that it had on the psychology of the period. And in black nationalist circles, there was a lot of talk around that time about the end of white civilization, that people were just seeing like the war showed the instability of whites was such a pointless war causing so much death and destruction that people were predicting that this was the end. I mean, white people were seeing it as that. There's a lot of sort of apocalyptic writing of the time period that this was really. I'm sure that's what caused, you know, books like the whole, you know, Rising Tide of Color, the Lothrop Stoddard book like that. There's that mentality of the time period about white people feeling like the walls were closing in on them, that their empires were crumbling, and anytime you have such a large number of white people dying over such a pointless war, you know, it was going to make white people nervous, you know. And I said that's one of the reasons why you will never see another war with white people. I know World War II continued the same thing, but it was just, you know, a backlash to the first war, World War II, and because after that you're not going to see any more wars of white people fighting white people because their numbers are too small. They're not going to get into a war with, you know, tens of millions of white people being killed. Now it's all about deeming the non-white world, the quote-unquote third world. You know, somebody had to explain to me why they call it the third world. Like, where's the second world? Like I always hate the term third world. People always use it so mindlessly. Where did that term come from? I have to look that up. You know, despite all of this nationalist thought about this apocalypse around that period, a lot of nationalists still thought black people fighting in the war would help them gain the respect of white people and gain rights. You know, you see the psychological damage of Africans colonized by whites on the continent, you know, that took the side of one white group over the other, saying like the British were more civilized or more moral than the Germans, even though the British had colonized them long before the Germans had, you know. And the same can be said about those colonized by the French. I mean, Frantz Fanon talked a lot about this sort of psychology. You know, this love for white people that abuse you has not gone away. You know, and I've read a lot of books about World War II, particularly, and the most annoying thing about reading those books is about how Africa is not even a factor. In almost any world, the First World War, the Second, about how Africa is not even a factor. You know, it's like Africa is just open land for white people to just fight over. There's no talk about African generals or commanders or armies. It's just nothing. Africa is just open space for white people to just come in, you know, turn the Africans into soldiers to fight. You know, the Africans exist to be used by whatever white people got there first. And it is infuriating so that we just let ourselves be used by white people so mindlessly. It is just infuriating how we allow ourselves to be used by white people. Just have not a shred of self-respect. You know, and this is exactly what Marcus Garvey wanted to stop. You know, W.B. Du Bois wasn't a separatist, but he wasn't an assimilationist either. He wasn't promoting race mixing as a solution to racism. You know, he promoted group behavior rather than individualism. You know, I'm sure this is why he eventually embraced socialism as an ideology. You know, as opposed to Garvey emulating sort of authoritarian countries in a more hierarchical structure in his organization. And the author acknowledges that nationalism historically has always been a response to oppression. And even the way the note that the book ends on is that you shouldn't, I said this was written in 1978, that you should expect more nationalist movements in the future, because as long as people are oppressed, nationalism will always pop up. It's a response. But the problem with it is that the nationalists often don't escape the culture of the people who've oppressed them. And of all the groups, the Nation of Islam comes the closest to distancing themselves from European culture and values. Compared to the people in this book, they come the closest in terms of distancing themselves. They still had a ways to go, but these other people didn't really, not completely distancing themselves from European culture and values. And you can't claim to be opposed to people and embrace their values and their culture at the same time. I do recommend this book to anyone who wants to gain a more nuanced view of the concept of black nationalism. Again, I want to make it clear that I don't have ill will towards figures like Alexander Crummell or Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington or W.B. Du Bois. Being that they've made many observations that victims don't seem to grasp even today, they in a lot of ways were ahead of the curve. Their flaws don't neutralize my sympathy for them. But I think, the depths of our brain trashing at the hands of whites is the biggest problem that we have as a people to this day. I'm sure there's a lot of information in this book. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff in this book that I haven't mentioned, because as I read it, I sometimes would have sticky notes that I put in the book and say, I got to remember that excerpt, got to remember that paragraph, got to remember that. There's so many quotations and things that I could go on that I just couldn't even keep track of them. I'm sure I'm probably leaving some stuff out, but that's why I recommend the book. But it's important that we study history to critique rather than just celebrate people. While we're still oppressed, celebrating people does not help us. Lessons can be learned from studying history. Looking for heroes in history is more about you feeling good. We don't need to feel good. We need to solve problems. That's why, like the Ben Tillman book last week, I do think that it would do black children a service to have them read books like this, or have books like this read to them. And it would do to realize that the bad thoughts in your mind regarding your race are not new. Even the most brilliant of the race who've been victimized still express the same level of self-hatred and confusion and pollution of white culture. There's nothing to feel guilty about. We all have the problem. I have the problem. Any African person listening to this has the problem at one level or another, and the goal should be to get rid of it. But I do definitely recommend this book to any African that wants to read it.
System of oppression being an immaturizing process. When the other people, say, may refer to us as boys, it is not just an attempt to put us down, but it is a part of an attempt to actually create in grown men an immature personality. That immature personality, of course, being one that cannot successfully challenge the system as it is. And that is achieved by withholding certain experiences from our children in the schools, certain experiences in life, those experiences being necessary for growth and development and growth into manhood and into womanhood. So the poorness of schools are a part of that process. Job discrimination is a part of that process. Bringing about a feeling of powerlessness and direct and overreactive opposition to our desires and wishes is also a part of that process, because these things are used to create in us a sense of powerlessness, an inability to do something about ourselves, and maintain in us a state of dependence which is quite characteristic of young children. So the oppressive system is set up by its very restrictions and by its stereotypes, you see, to create a mentality that retards mental and psychological growth. It is there also not only to immaturize us as people in general, but to feminize us as men as well. To emasculate the black man. And of course, we've talked about that a great deal, I'm sure on these microphones. You can see that even in the kind of leadership we provide. And when I use that word feminize, I'm speaking of it in the old stereotypical sense of where a certain dependency was created and maintained, where let me just be more straightforward about it. In the older sense, before liberation or before the impact of women's liberation became very apparent and effective, often many women, and not all women by any stretch of the imagination, thought that their route to, say, power and prestige and acceptance was basically through marriage, through becoming attached to some man and assuming his name or his identity. And therefore she would get a vicarious kind of power if her husband was powerful, if she carried the name of the husband and so forth. And so her major approaches under that old system was one of seduction, that is, seducing a man perhaps into marriage, seducing him into attachment, or sometimes a process of inducing guilt or a sense of protectiveness on the part of the man, these kinds of things. Or the greater part of her energies might have been directed toward making herself attractive instead of developing her intellectual and other potentials. So her approach in the older sense, and I want to be clear about that because I don't want any misunderstandings of people, in the older sense then, it was going at power indirectly through attachments. Now, to a good degree, I think that the assimilationist approach to the movement of our people is a very similar one and sort of feminine in that sense. It's not an approach that directly challenges the power of Europeans or the power of the white man. It is not an approach that is ready to go to war and to defeat our enemies. When we talk about racism, you see, we talk about racism, but we don't talk about it in a way that we can neutralize the racists. We talk about it more in the way of getting the racist to change his or her attitude, or to change their feelings toward us, or to accept us, in a sense to marry us and to become one with us. But there's another way, of course, approaching it that says, look, you can be as racist as you want to. You can hate me and you can despise me, but you are not in a position to do a damn thing about it, because I have power to prevent you from carrying out your racist plans. You see, and we, of course, now again, stereotypically see that as a masculine approach. And again, I'm using it just as a term of convenience that says, look, we are moving from a position of power, and we want to build our own IBMs, our own Xerox Corporation, our own armies, our own nations, and not marry into you and become attached to you through some kind of curious identification with you. Because what happens is that still leaves you disarmed. It still leaves you in a position that if your husband divorces you, you're not in a position to carry on your own life and protect your own interests. It still leaves you in a position that if your quote-unquote husband decides that he will attack you or drop you in some kind of way, it still doesn't prepare you to provide for yourself and to take care of yourself. So
lastly, what I want to talk about is not a book that I've read, but just over the past week, all of the headlines that I've read, and I knew it was coming. Once this death toll started to go up with this coronavirus, I was just waiting to see the news headlines talking about black people being affected at a disproportionate rate, and of black people dying at a higher rate than other groups. And so many articles I've seen over the past week, whether it be in Louisiana, Illinois, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, Michigan, Washington, D.C., and I'm sure many other places that I haven't read articles about, where black people are dying at a disproportionate rate. You know, you haven't read articles even about non-white people in the UK dying at a disproportionate rate. You know, and this information is consistent with what I read in Portraits of White Racism, and the thoughts that came across my mind were consistent with what I'd read in Portraits of White Racism, and the reason this is happening is directly connected to the assimilationist thought that I read in the golden age of black nationalism. You know, white supremacy means being white, you will suffer the least of all other groups. You know, this is why black people are disproportionately affected by all harmful things in this society. You know, affected by every illness at a higher rate. You know, lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality rate, higher rate of homelessness, higher incarceration rate. Every war we fight in, we're always killed at a disproportionate rate. This is always by design under white supremacy. This is why whites are for the death penalty, because they know that we're going to get that far more frequently than they are. We're going to be the ones executed at a far higher rate than they will. Everything affects us at a disproportionate. Even though people are so frequently, often wrongly imprisoned in this society, they're still for the death penalty. You know, they know they'll be affected, less by all of these things. You know, the way the society is structured, the areas black people are forced to live in, the types of jobs black people are forced to have. When things go bad, we are helpless against any epidemic. You know, this is what the assimilationist ideology creates. You know, we remain helpless because we think white people will protect us, and they never do. You know, we've learned nothing from Hurricane Katrina. And as I said, in this society, under white supremacy, black people are not supposed to learn anything. You know, I said on the last post that we're a nationless people. You know, nations have leaders. Leaders have contingency plans. Leaders see it as their responsibility to think the unthinkable, to have a plan for any situation. We have no leaders, no institutions, no real organizations, and no direction as a race. And situations like this, it's just all the more obvious. You know, Hillary Clinton might have jumped on the problem faster than Trump, but black people still would have been dying at a higher rate. And the Trump administration, just, all his bragging about black unemployment being the lowest it's been in history, how has that protected black people? What kind of jobs were black people, having that made unemployment the lowest rate? Because everybody knows that the kind of jobs that black people have in this society, the vast majority of them are the kind of jobs that they can't do from home. You know, white people economically are far ahead of us. We as a group have about 1 percentage point of the wealth that they have. You know. Is not even close when it comes to wealth by comparison. So the kind of jobs that we fill are just the crappiest manufacturing jobs, kind of jobs where you have to be there to do it. You cannot do it sitting at your computer at home. You know, like I just a few months ago quit a manufacturing job and got the kind of job that you can do from home. That's why I'm fortunate. I'm a rarity that I actually a couple of months ago started a job that I do on a computer that I actually, before all this even broke out, I started the job and was so glad that, in retrospect, that I did quit that other job, that otherwise I'd be having to go to a factory every day under these circumstances and exposing myself like so many of us have to do to get paid. But white people know this is always going to happen. Both political parties want us to be dependent on white people ultimately. Republicans and Democrats, both of them. Neither one of them want us to have power of our own. regardless of what they might say. Neither wants us to have anything of our own, any power, any sort of, they want, both of us want us to be under white people and be dependent on white people's to protect us. We have to be sitting ducks under white supremacy, always. And if you see our destiny as being inseparable from the destiny of white people, then you have no problem with this. You have no problem with what you're seeing now. Because I said assimilationism is a death philosophy. And now you see, white people, white people in a situation like this, they're going to be linking black people to this virus, I'm sure, and perpetuating the idea that black people is, some disease-prone race, associating us with this virus at a disproportionate rate is going to promote that sort of thinking again, that we're some diseased, medical apartheid. I posted the book on YouTube, white people, of us being some disease-prone race, sort of image. Some people attributing us being affected at a disproportionate rate to us not wanting to wear masks because whites criminalize us so much that we don't want to walk around with masks on and be hassled by law enforcement. Again, so everything is set up to benefit white people. Everything is designed to make our lives more difficult. You have racist French doctors suggesting that a vaccine should be tested on Africans, Again, these white people are not ignorant of their history of medical atrocities. They make that very clear. They are not ignorant about. All over the world, white people are not ignorant. Some people attribute it to black people not trusting the medical industry. But that's just another effort to blame us for even though black people shouldn't trust the medical industry, we still trust it more than we should. But it's just another effort to blame us for what's happening. And assimilationism requires self-blame. A healthy black mind doesn't end with acknowledging the evils of whites, but it has to start there. People who are against us being an empowered race always, why do you blame white people for this? And why we got to stop talking about slavery and talk about white people have done. It's that if you disregard what white people have done to African people the world over, self-hatred is all you have left. Self-hatred will take over. The study of our psychology, the study of abuse victims is the psychology of abuse victims is what you need to do to understand the psychology of assimilationist. Particularly abuse victims that don't confront the abuser. Like a child that doesn't acknowledge their abusive parent, doesn't acknowledge that they're being abused, and actually see the parent as an abuser, is going to blame themselves. They're going to eventually see themselves as deserving of the abuse. And most likely grow up and be an abuser themselves, and that's us. We don't want to acknowledge the abuser. So the only option you have left is to abuse yourself, blame yourself, and convince yourself that you deserve to be abused. Just like a woman being abused by a partner is if she doesn't confront and deal with the abuser, she's gonna blame herself and see her abuse as deserving, and make herself convince herself that it's not it's her fault, and get used to the abuse. Rather than stop it, just see it as normal. This is us. This is we are used to. We convince ourselves that we deserve to be abused, and gotten used to it. Blame ourselves, and that is a mindset that none of us should have. That is a mindset to always veer away from completely, and that is a mindset that white people want us to have. And that is a mindset that convinces us that love for the aggressor, love for the abuser, love for white people is a sickness. Wanting to go to bed with the descendant of someone who raped your ancestors is as sick as it gets. That is disgusting, and that is us. Assimilationists think that clinging to white people will keep them from being exterminated. There's golden age of black nationalism, there's a passage like that too about I forget which person said it, but suggesting that if we try to separate from white people, we'll be killed. Thinking that the only way we can be safe is to cling to white people, and they'll protect us. The only reason white people haven't exterminated us is that we do serve a purpose in the society. The other. That's the purpose we serve. And white people have now latched onto the narrative that we are exterminating ourselves so they don't have to. Whites in America are very conscious of how they look to other countries. They don't want, they're far more refined than the Nazis. They wouldn't want the whole world looking at America and thinking that white people are mistreating black people, so they have to convince the world that we're destroying ourselves. So therefore, if one day there's hardly any of us left, they can tell the world that we did it to ourselves. And they had nothing to do with it. It's like they pretend like they have nothing to do with the conditions of people on the African continent. Everyone now, all of a sudden, white people have nothing to do with it. Centuries of the rape of the African continent and mass murder all over the continent. Now, all of a sudden, white people have nothing to do with people starving or people dying of disease and the underdevelopment, the forced underdevelopment of the African continent, and now pretend like white people had nothing to do with it all of a sudden. Total nonsense. Every problem that people have on the African continent is the fault of white people. White people, and it benefits white people. And I wish somebody would make a movie where barriers popped up on Earth separating every continent from each other. Barriers that nobody could cross, invisible barriers where planes couldn't get through, boats couldn't get through, and every continent had to exist on its own, cut off from every other in the world. And show how dependent these nations are on these European nations are on these continents that they rape and rob, and how the dark world is full of all of the world's resources. The poorest people in the world are on the land with all the resources, and the richest people in the world are on land that has nothing. And seeing what would happen if white people were cut off and couldn't get to the resources in these nations that they rob every day, and what they would look like years into the future. I wish somebody would do that, rather than speak all this nonsense about these European nations being independent. Or Asians and these nations being so independent. They're all just crooks, But white people today see us, the way, like I said, the way Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf. That's how white people see black people today. They don't see us as a threat, really, to their power. We're just animals imitating human behavior. We have no power. We don't want power. We think them having power is going to protect us. It's not going to protect us. We think American whites are too sophisticated to exterminate us. I say, Ben Tillman was white trash, but the Nazis were well-educated, technologically advanced people, and they had a well-run machine manufactured and treated mass murder as an industry, a mechanical industry of wiping people out in as efficient a manner as possible, calculating every possible way to kill people in a more efficient way. And these are educated people. When people try to convince you that dumb rednecks are the most dangerous people, educated people are the most dangerous people. Educated people created, the atomic bomb. These people, the amount of time white people will spend developing military hardware and weapons to kill people, and you think that rednecks, white trash, are the people you should be afraid of? No. Every day these people think about new ways to kill people. And yet we think they would never use any of that on us. When white people feel their whiteness is under attack, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. They will kill any non-white people in sight. They will exterminate if they feel their whiteness is attacked. And the vulnerable position we keep ourselves in, we're just waiting for them to snap. One day, in the future, they're convinced that their whiteness is under attack, we're in a position to be wiped out. And this is the kind of stuff that leaders are supposed to be thinking about. But we don't have any leaders. White people in this country are capable of anything. Anything that any other white people in the world are capable of, they're capable of. We might stay weak to give them no reason to see us as a threat, but it doesn't matter if the threat is real or not. It didn't matter. The Nazis didn't matter if the Jews were a real threat or not. They considered them a threat, and it didn't matter if it was true or not. And the Jews had more power than we do, and yet they still were able to be systematically ostracized from the society and then put through the meat grinder. But we're still too scared to arouse the anger of whites by pursuing power. That fear has to end if it's going to survive as a race. We don't need black nationalism as defined by the book that I read. We don't need that. We need a new ideology that centers around African survival and empowerment with no influence whatsoever of other races and cultures. Completely a new culture, a new pro-African culture that makes reference to our history and our ancestors in a respectful way, but does not simply put people on a pedestal even if they said the wrong thing. An intelligent black ideology, pro-black ideology that is about us having a new African economy, an African industry, African land, an African military, and African-centered goals based on African values. We need the love for Europeans purged out of our psyches. If you're against these things, then the coronavirus is your friend. And that's all I got to say for right now. Thanks for listening.